I'm Reverend Michelle Scott-Huffman. My pronouns are she, her. I am a middle-aged, pale woman with dark circles around my eyes. Wearing blue pants and a sweater with blue stripes today because I decided that I'd worn too much plaid this week. And I have short, dark, spiky hair. Did I say I'm the minister here? Okay, that too. William Arthur Ward has written a poem called To Risk, and it goes like this. To laugh is to risk appearing a fool. To weep is to risk appearing sentimental. To reach out to another is to risk involvement. To expose feelings is to risk exposing your true self. To place your ideas and dreams before a crowd is to risk their loss. To love is to risk not being loved in return. To live is to risk dying. To hope is to risk despair. To try is to risk failure. But risks must be taken because the greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing. The person who risks nothing, does nothing, has nothing, is nothing. They may avoid suffering and sorrow, but they cannot learn, feel, change, grow, or live. With today's service, we kick off a month of conversation around our Soul Matters theme, vulnerability. Before you all go running for the door, let me make a case for why it might do us all good to spend time reflecting on such a thing. There are lots of ways to define vulnerability, but most commonly they include something like to be susceptible to emotional or physical harm, or to be at risk. And we're all like, oh great, let's work on that. If you're in the group of people not cheering, yay, vulnerability, know that I'm with you. For much of my life, childhood and adulthood, I have worn my stoicism like a badge of honor. It was a comfortable life. It didn't occur to me that I was missing out on anything until I was about 35 and I started having conversations with my now wife. And she said, "What's wrong with you? Why don't you have any emotions?" I'm not sure if she meant the question rhetorically or not, but I don't think I answered out loud. What I did do, though, was internally I started compiling a whole list of reasons that my way of being was clearly superior. First and foremost, ain't nobody got time for all that. Feelings are inefficient, time-consuming, thought-consuming, anxiety-producing friction magnets. And did I mention how inefficient they are? Stoicism teaches the development of self-control and fortitude as a means of overcoming destructive emotions, and holds that becoming a clear and unbiased thinker allows one to understand the universal reason. I have no reasoned critique of Stoic philosophy. I'm not qualified for such things. But I will say that there probably aren't a list of Stoics at the top of any history's most well-rounded and healthy human beings list. And hopefully we're at least being honest enough to question whether any of us are capable of totally clear and unbiased thinking, as if any of us are looking at the world through a lens that is not colored by our geography, language, culture, education, experience, and more. All of this trendy talk about vulnerability is an invitation for us, but in reality, it's not an invitation to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is simply a fact of human life. It just is. It's not something that we can opt into or out of. Consider the ways that this truth is known by anyone who has found themselves unemployed during an economic downturn when they just were on a path of career success. They've done all the right things, they show up in all the right places, and the economy made a different decision for them. Or the ways this is known by anyone who has experienced the devastating loss of a loved one suddenly, or in unknown or inconceivable circumstances, or even after a long illness. Or anyone who's begun a new decade of life and discovered that almost like clockwork, the body parts have decided to not do the thing that they used to do. Or anyone who was born into a family of imperfect humans who didn't know how to love them well, or chose not to do so. Or anyone whose authentic expression of themselves is someone else's excuse for bigotry and bad behavior. I could go on all day, but I suspect that this list has stirred something in all of us, unless we are so deeply entrenched in our stoicism that we refuse to allow ourselves to feel the feelings. The season of Lent in the Christian tradition recently began with Ash Wednesday. On Ash Wednesday, those who participate are marked on their forehead with ashes, typically derived from burning the previous year's palm fronds from Palm Sunday. Even the process of preparing the ashes speaks to the vulnerability of living things. The palm fronds, carefully cut and waved jubilantly in celebration on last year's Palm Sunday, have now died and have been reduced to a pile of ash. The day is meant to be an entry into a season of introspection, repentance, and an acknowledgement of one's mortality, marked most notably by the words spoken during the imposition of ashes, "Remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return." My own struggle with this practice started when I had planted a new church that was full of people who lived in the constant shadow of their own mortality and that of the people around them. People living in black and brown bodies that resembled those lying lifeless on the street, on the sidewalk, in the park, in the now all too common images of forced mortality on display. People living with mental health struggles that are constantly reminding them, teasing them with their perceived nothingness. People for whom a diagnosis or disability keeps them up close and personal with the reality of mortality. Queer and trans youth and young adults who have lost friends who should still be here enjoying their life with them. None of these people needed to be reminded of their mortality. Most of them needed a reminder of the beauty and wonder that exists in the world because they are here, living and breathing, taking up space and gracing us with their presence. I've since adapted my own Ash Wednesday practice to include glitter and the words, "Remember you are stardust." I say all of that to say that in every message, in every strategy for better living, even in every religious practice, there are parts and pieces that are for each of us individually. They are exactly what we need in a given moment and give us the motivation or maybe the permission to take ourselves to the next level. And there are things that we can leave behind because they aren't for us, or at least they aren't for us in this moment. What AJ shared in the moment of perspective is important because some people hearing these words right now are painfully aware of their vulnerability. And the last thing they need is someone to encourage them to embrace it. There will be times in all of our lives when it is safe and reasonable for us to learn to lean into our vulnerability and to welcome what it teaches us, what it grows in us, and even who it calls us to become. Later this month, we'll talk in greater detail about some critiques and concerns surrounding, for instance, what has been called courage culture, and the way it tends to overlook the reality of marginalized experiences, which are full of uninvited vulnerability. In the meantime, we begin with a surface exploration of the theme of vulnerability and invite you to step into the conversation where it connects with you. The song that we sang at the beginning of the service, "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen." I understand that that's true for every human being in this room, that we all have struggles, that it hasn't been time to share, or we haven't been free to share, or we haven't understood how we could share. My hope is that as a community, we come to a place where somebody knows the troubles we've all seen, because we've built a space of grace and love and vulnerability that welcomes that in a safe way but doesn't force it. Hear me when I say, nobody owes you the truth of their struggles. When we talk about being a covenanted community, there are people who come in who don't necessarily feel safe yet, and we don't get to hear their whole story, and some of us might find out a little ways down the line pieces of their story that we didn't know, and we might respond by saying, why did they lie to me? Well, they didn't. It was just none of your business. And so coming together in community is hard stuff, because we have to come into a space where we can learn to trust one another, where we can believe that people are coming with their best intentions, and also that the impact of words and actions is real, and that we can acknowledge that, and we can own it, and we can grow together. That's the space where people can tell you their truths, where people can live into a piece, a part of this community. Human beings are vulnerable. I would venture to say that we're not alone in that all living beings are vulnerable. Perhaps the difference is that some other living beings cover their vulnerability with aggression. Perhaps there's something special in the human capacity to identify, name, and process emotional and physical pain in a different, more productive way. Some of us, myself included, get stuck sometimes in that biological response to our vulnerability. We're probably all familiar with fight, flight, or freeze. The invitation in this month is to try something different. When and where possible, lean into a vulnerability and trust that the process may take you somewhere, at least emotionally, that you haven't been before. The caveat here is that we may be vulnerable with another person, being honest about our feelings or our fears, and that person may not reciprocate. Or worse, they may betray our confidence and share our story with others, or use it against us in some way. We are all human. This is the risk of which the poet spoke in the words I read at the beginning of this message. To expose feelings is to risk exposing your true self. To place your ideas and dreams before a crowd is to risk their loss. To love is to risk not being loved in return. And if we are to build beloved community, these are risks that we must take collectively, as individuals are able to be a part of the collective whole, to participate in creating that kind of a space. We who live in privileged spaces will have to relinquish some of that privilege to sit in spaces where we can learn from those at the margins. That in itself is a vulnerability, giving up the power and privilege that we hold in a space because it's our space, to go be present in someone else's space. It means that we stop trying to always be the host and we learn to be the guest. In interfaith spaces, for instance, that means that Christians step aside from hosting these Christian events with a nod to other religions in the room and calling it interfaith, and show up in spaces that are primarily Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, pagan, and not to have all the speaking parts, but to watch and listen. It means that people who have lived their lives steeped in the social construct that is whiteness show up invited, not unexpected, to spaces that are predominantly cultivated and facilitated by people of color, instead of constantly saying, if they want us to learn, why aren't they here? Expending all of their emotional energy on us. It means that people who don't understand how fundamentally important honoring pronouns is and creating space that is safe and welcoming for LGBTQ persons avail ourselves of the literally thousands upon thousands of educational pieces, books, videos, articles, infographics, human beings whose life work is to educate folks on this stuff. Just to avail ourselves of that information and learn. It means that we who have great pride in being keepers and even teachers of knowledge and wisdom admit that all knowledge is incomplete. That we will always have more to learn from others whose life experience differs from our own. And that a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the fourth UU principle, is perhaps meant to be a lifelong endeavor, not a destination at which we arrive and wait for others to join us. Those are just some of the ways that we can connect with vulnerability to make us a more just, loving, and welcoming community. And it's true that every one of us has our own internal work with vulnerability as well. Sometimes it may feel like our own personal work is more than we can bear and that we can't possibly also be working in community on these larger and equally urgent challenges. June Ellis has written, "We know with varying degrees of acceptance into awareness our own weaknesses. And there is a tendency to think that others, who seem on the surface to be very sure and confident, do not struggle in the way we do. But many of those who appear to cope and be strong and tireless are indeed very different behind their masks. We are all wounded. We all feel inadequate and ashamed. We all struggle. But this is part of the human condition. It draws us together, helps us to find our connectedness. This is where we live out the love that we talked about last month. We trust one another to know when to press into vulnerability as a growing edge and when to retreat and protect ourselves. We accept that everyone, every single person has their own struggles that we know nothing about, and that nobody owes us self-revelation. But that in being community together and building strong, authentic relationships, self-revelation will likely happen over time when each person feels safe and secure to do so. And perhaps most importantly, we commit ourselves to remaining in relationship together and working through hard stuff. Because as UUs, it's not creed or dogma that holds us together. It's our covenant with one another. I leave you with a challenge from Tokopa, who writes, "We've made a hedging around the very places we should be depending on one another. We've privatized pain, and then it's hard to reach out. It's hard to be seen with your messy lostness, exhaustion, and overwhelm as you stumble through the complexities of life. But how else can someone become trustworthy unless you allow them to share in your hardship? How can we form the village we ache for unless we allow ourselves to wrestle with these things together? May the wrestling now commence. Blessed be, and amen."